Welcome back to the Developer Tribe for episode 4 of season 2, and it's shaping up to be a really exciting set of guests and topics. This time out, we're exploring the issues surrounding competition in academy youth football, with wider implications of the winning versus development arguments so prevalent in youth sport. So, as ever, thank you for being here, however you got here, and with that, let's jump in. My guest today is an academy coach at Oxford United F.C. and a primary school teaching assistant with previous experience as a head coach at Pontardawe Town Academy, Challenger Sports in the US, and at Swansea City AFC Community Trust. He recently completed an MSc in Advanced Performance Football Coaching, his research from which we will be talking about today. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the lot is having got through living with me in Pontypridd. It's my pleasure to welcome my good friend, Peter Wynne, to the pod.
How are you, Tim?
I'm very well, thank you. It's been literally days since I last saw you.
It has, yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Look, you and I talk a fair bit as it is, and those conversations do tend to go on a bit. I suspect that's both our faults, so we're best crack on, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so look, talk to us about what that research was for your masters.
So my research looked into the academy system in England and Wales, interviewing coaches from the foundation phase, so under nines, all the way up through to the professional development phase, including heads of coaching, lead phase coaches, and professional FA coach developers. The research basically asked for their opinions and insights into what they felt was the views on competition at the elite academy level. So what the current structure is, how they feel it works, whether there needs to be change, or whether it's quite suited at the moment. Now, of course, those coaches were not just from one particular category status of academy. They were taken from category 1, which is the highest level of academy category, all the way through to category 3. Now, of course, the games program looks very different from category 1 all the way through to category 3. So the experiences that a lot of those coaches have had, are quite different. And I was fortunate enough to interview coaches that had coached at different youth phases. So started in the foundation, now maybe working towards the top end of youth development phase, to coaches that have worked in the academy system and now maybe taking up a coach developing structure in terms of their role now, and they're working from that perspective. Likewise, when coaches talk about going from category 3, say, through to a category 1 games program, it looks very different. But there were similar trends that were evident in all the categories, which is what I'd love to discuss on this podcast.
Yeah, and look, I've been fortunate enough to talk to you several times about this already, so looking forward to unpacking it even further today. Just to clarify, so you had coaches across the different phases, foundation phase being 7 to 11, youth development phase 12 to 16.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, and then professional development phase 18 to 23.
Yeah, basically. So it's under 18. So post 16 once they get their scholarships, right, through to the 21s.
Well, look, you've already spoken about differences between Cat 1 to Cat 3, and there are a myriad of them. So yes, let's stick to what competition looks like for those 3 categories. What are the major differences?
So, of course, the category 1 games program tends to have a little bit more structure. There's a little bit more variety throughout the season. They have got an element of competition, which coaches shared with me. but this was only maybe once a season in terms of a national tournament. And of course, they added on top of that, if you get knocked out after the first couple of rounds, then those players don't get those exposures like other teams, or maybe stronger Cat 1 teams that will get then a few more games. So it's not very consistent, which is what a lot of the coaches mention.
And is it a case of trying to get a more equal exposure to competition across the categories? Is that kind of what you were finding?
Yeah, I think, a lot of, especially coaches that have gone from, say, a Cat 3, maybe, or Cat 2 or something, to then a Cat 1, they found that obviously in Cat 1 there's evidence of it, and their experiences with competition and being in those tournaments are fascinating to listen to and question, because God, the boys and the players and the experience those players get is excellent, brilliant. The social, the emotional management of those players and what they have to try and deal with, say if they're in a game and they know that obviously if they don't win, they get knocked out. And arguably those coaches say, well, that's what those boys need to start understanding at 13, 14 years of age, is they need to understand that, playing in a game, you will have a consequence for losing. And that phrase has been repeated many, many times, consequences for losing. Have we got enough consequences for if players lose?
Well, look, let's kind of look at it from the opposite side then, as to kind of why we've ended up in this situation. Obviously, I've worked in academy football as well, and I was in foundation phase, and the sense was winning doesn't matter, development is the focus. But I had a group of players who were naturally extremely competitive, with perhaps the exception of one or two. And I think that both myself and my dual coach that I was working with are also fairly competitive. So it was a case of just striking a balance of, look, winning and losing does matter, but so long as you're focusing more on what is your individual development, team development, the score will take care of itself, kind of thing. And we were fortunate enough to be involved in some Premier League tournaments, like the power plays, that kind of thing. And also our foundation phase lead, Luke Smith, who's now at West Ham, he went out of his way to get friendlies for us with Category 2, Category 1s. And really without that, we would have struggled for competition at times. But during that time, I was very aware that there was no league that we were playing in. There wasn't any sort of win-loss draw. And that felt a little bit saccharine, is the way that I would describe it.
Yes, so, coaches say stagnant.
Okay.
As well, and linking back to one of your previous points is that focus on winning came up a lot, and obviously coaches' messages to players would tend to be, boys, obviously we want to go and win the game, but our presence as a coach wanting our players to maybe win the game then borders on that phrase of win at all costs. And really, where's the definition? Where's the definitive line between, obviously coaches want to win, the players want to win. But where is that phrase of, well, win at all costs? Because coaches will obviously avoid that. And I think then that topic of just competition, winning, is just avoided, completely avoided. And the spotlight is very much angled in a different way to allow players just to perform without that pressure or focus on, look, boys, if we win today, we get the opportunity to maybe play another game. Or look, if we win today, we might have a chance of maybe winning the league. And I'm sure we'll be able to discuss further on maybe what that might look like and what coaches may have sort of said what it might look like. But in terms of, that win at all costs and development, it was very much scrutinized because coaches want and feel and have seen the benefits of what players perform like in a competitive game.
So there's a sense of, I mean, look, the winning versus development argument happens a lot. We've come across it as contemporary issues in our own studies. There are coaches up and down the UK who are grappling with that particular issue. If I've understood our conversations before on this, the sense from the coaches that you researched, and then your own sense as well, was that not that the way to deal with this is to immediately implement competition where every game matters and that winning becomes a focus. More that we have potentially swung too far the other way towards the development side. Games don't matter in terms of the result in any format, that actually players getting closer to professional development phase have lacked exposure to competition and therefore are unable to deal with the pressures that competition brings.
Yeah, of course. And, there were quite a few coaches in that sort of phase towards the very top that have commented on, we get loads of players technically excellent, tactically understand the game really, really well. But now they're in a league. They're playing competitively every single week at under 18s. And a lot of them just can't really cope with being under that pressure. Just natural pressure, we would describe it as, at that level of being able to go, well, we're 1-0 down. We need to go and win the game. And it is as simple as that. And I think we've turned the spotlight away so much, like you've said, that paradigm of going into development as opposed to focusing on a bit of winning. And a few of the coach developers and stuff did mention that they think it's swinging back, but there's obviously hesitation as it swings towards maybe, well, actually, look, we do need elements of players needing to win, players being exposed to opportunities where, look, winning does matter, but also learning to cope. Well, if we do lose this game, then obviously there's maybe a bit of pressure on the next game. And, to sort of mention a few coaches that, they sort of say it as a bit, winning's turned into a bit of a dirty word in the sense. Your previous sort of questions about really the contrast between academy football and where it's sort of gone to, the angle at which it's gone to with reference to obviously competition. It's quite the opposite to maybe your grassroots football. Well, obviously a lot of, most coaches have started off. If you look at the grassroots game and see the academy system and the games program there, I can count numerous times when coaches have said it feels a bit like the opposite way round in that sense, where, you've got a games program with competitive games every single week from arguably 11 years old up to then academy football, where you'll get the odd festival or the odd sort of futsal festival around Christmas where it's competitive or there's a little bit of a trophy at the end or something. And the rest of the games are just sort of, focus on your, individual learning plans, focus on the game targets, just those sorts of things. And we're assessing players against those ILPs, but in an environment where arguably it completely changes if you say, put an importance on that match. For instance, lads, look, if we win this game, next game might become a bit easier, or the next game might actually mean that the opposition now are going to be struggling. All of those things matter, and they make a big difference, especially at the level that these boys are playing at in terms of football. It makes such a difference to the way they make decisions on the ball, their confidence, their motivation up to weekdays. Loads of coaches said, the week leading up to one of those tournament games at Cat 1, they just saw such a difference in the preparation of some of their players that they'd never seen before. Players were preparing a little bit differently because they knew that the game was more important than maybe other games that they've experienced before. And the coaches just said, well, why don't we have more of that? Because at 13, 14 years old, arguably in 3 or 4 years' time, they could be playing in one of the top 3 leagues of English football.
Yeah. So why has the pendulum swung that way? What was the rationale for let's remove this sense of competition? Let's remove the recording of results. What was the rationale behind it? How have we ended up here?
I think one of the coaches that I interviewed had a vast amount of experience, and I was very grateful for being able to interview him. And he sort of, from his perspective and his opinion, and obviously he'd experienced it firsthand since the early 2000s. Saying, well, back then the system in England mainly was that we were developing lots of physically determined, gritty, shall we say, players, but technically, struggled against maybe European partners. So, in terms of the development, the system, the governing body needed to just shift because we were creating players that were able to deal with the physicalities of the game and love, going 1-0 down and trying to fight their way back. But technically and tactically, maybe not anywhere near the European teams that we were looking around us. So I would say that it started off roughly there. Then we've focused purely on the development. We've obviously looked at our grassroots game, seen maybe the more negative sides of what competition and what league tables does to maybe participation with kids football as they get older. And obviously parents are volunteering their time and everything like that to just basically to use this as a participation basis for kids just to play football. And you've got a league system there where obviously every game is measured, every goal is measured, and that purely really is the only focus at that level of football, is that league table. There's nothing really else apart from participation. You've just got that league table.
Right, and that's the major issue, isn't it? That if we were to swing back the other way, particularly in grassroots, but as we both know, this happens in academy football as well.
Yeah,
adult expectations on a youth game, and my feeling is that perhaps one of the reasons we've ended up here is because as a coaching world in the UK, there has still been this real push of cultural values of that grittiness, as you said, or that pushing for winning, or that players should automatically be motivated to win the game. But also we've learned a lot more about coaching science and the psychological side of the game, focusing on task rather than outcome. These things have all come into play, of course. So my sense is that there is another way here. You're not necessarily suggesting, right, well, let's just put everything back to where it was. This was an experiment that's gone wrong.
Not at all.
So start talking to us about what the alternatives are, because we've stated that competition, perhaps the exposure to competition isn't high enough.
Yes.
We're also saying that we don't want it to be too much. So how on earth do we get this balance?
When I first posed this topic to a lot of the coaches, they needed to apply it themselves in some sort of example. to help them understand what it might look like, therefore making it easier for them to answer a lot of the questions. So a lot of them, came up with, linking it to their ILPs and their cycles of development. So, on a 6 week basis, perhaps having like a small league within that 6 weeks where you've got 4 or 5 teams and the league finishes at the end of that 6 weeks. So you don't get this pre-season targets and goals for going, this season we're going to win the league, because the league will be over in 6 weeks and another league will start in maybe a month's time, or a tournament might start in a month's time. By breaking it up in that way, and look, in the first team, if you look at first team football, that's broken up in terms of FA Cup, EFL, Premier League, Champions League, all of those things. They're all broken up, even pre-season. All the games are broken up, so it gets them used to having to prepare for a game that's more important than maybe the game that's coming up next. And that is vital when you look at, specifically in the youth development phase, where we're preparing players from 12 years old through to 16 to go and play in arguably the most competitive, highly viewed leagues in the world. And because of that, I don't think we have developed enough players that are able to manage and emotionally control their performances. And that's where they get let down. I think technically and tactically, they are efficient to play within those leagues. But arguably, have we mentally prepared them enough at the younger ages? Because we can't just state a 16-year-old that's never really played for 3 points in his life to go and then train with the first team, even, that are playing for 3 points like their lives depend on it. The environments of where he's come from to where he is now in that first team are opposites, polar apart. And the question is, are we doing enough? Can we do more to help that 16-year-old prepare themselves mentally, I would say, more for first team football?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I was also thinking, with my coach developer head on, for the coach too.
Of course.
If you're not used to matches that matter, tournaments that matter, it's very, very easy to then become emotionally hijacked and revert to, it mattering too much and not being able to emotionally control ourselves, and therefore not being able to help our young players emotionally regulate too, because of emotional contagion and so on. So I get the sense that there are 2 ways in which this might support the coaches more too. That we're not having to fabricate competition as much in our training session, right? In order to,
of course, yeah, because likewise, you've got obviously competition if it's naturally presented to players on the weekend. For example, that under-13s National Cup, where they're playing another Cat 1 side. The coach does not need to remind those boys of maybe the importance or the outcomes, so consequences, shall we say, of that game based on the result. The coach does not need to tell those boys before the game, or likewise in the week leading up to the game. And that's the difference. That is crucial in terms of how players can perform, not just in games, but in training. Because if there isn't anything on the games on the weekends, boys will obviously turn up to the games, play the games, focus on their ILPs and performance outcomes, and then evaluate it and reflect on it. And then they'll just go into the next week, and it just drifts from that week in, week out, until the coach says, boys, we've got a festival coming up, or this futsal tournament we've got coming up, or it's competitive. But the players haven't felt what that feels like. So they can't be expected then to go or change their mindset into more of a winning attitude and a desire to get something out of the game. And a brilliant example of this was a coach that was coaching down in London, and there was a festival there. And he was coaching an under 11s team. They were 2-0 down with 5 minutes to go. The boys score to get one back, but they don't go and get the ball, or they don't really celebrate. They just run back to the halfway line and wait for the opposition to start the game. And the coach stood there, was thinking, obviously, go and get the ball because we've only got 5 minutes left to get a goal, or you're out, or you're out of the competition, basically. Mm-hmm. We go home. And he just reflected in that moment and afterwards. And that these boys haven't got that competitive experience. They haven't got the opportunities, or they haven't been exposed, to the opportunities to think, right, well, we've only got 5 minutes left. So if we don't score, obviously we just go out. And maybe in the past that's been avoided, and currently maybe is avoided, by looking at it going, well, we haven't got a goal, boys. And only later or afterwards, the players realise, oh, we needed to get another goal. Then we would have maybe played again.
Yeah.
But it's all driven.
Do you think as well, it's when we're in those situations with young players, that sometimes it almost feels like if we put them in situations where they experience, let's call it trauma for now. I'm not sold on that word, but let's call it trauma for now, of losing, that somehow we as coaches, or parents if it's grassroots, but we as coaches have to solve that particular emotional problem for those kids. That for whatever reason, it's not okay, and I'm not saying it is, but it's not okay for some reason that in these situations, kids can't be crying, angry, dismissive, that they can't experience conflict. For me, that feels just disingenuine. Like, if that's even a word, it doesn't feel genuine.
You're right, and that's very similar to the way I felt about it, and the reason why I put this research together in the first place. Let's be honest. And a lot of the things that obviously coaches then shared is that we create lots of situations where, as a coach, we are then accountable, or we are responsible for managing that emotion or that social situation without maybe letting the players just try and work it out for themselves. We talk about technically and tactically trying to let the players work it out for themselves, but we can do that socially and psychologically, as well as the technical and tactical aspects. And a few of the other coaches say, well, we have confidence, we have motivation, we have resilience. How do we really develop those things? And I mean really develop those things if those players are not going on a sort of journey, if you like, through emotions of feeling, God, I wish I won that game, or God, if we just got another goal, we may have been able to get 3 points for that game.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's the pinnacle of the season, because it might be over in a month, which is the point. Because let's be honest, they're obviously not mature enough to be able to deal with, say, the pressure of a season-long league system where they're doing really well before Christmas. After Christmas, it gets really difficult. And that's where the problem lies with the win at all costs, because, coaches then feel like they've done really well before Christmas. They're maybe a bit harder on the players after Christmas because they're not doing so well. But it's all because it's measured within the same system, league system. Whereas if you cut that down to, say, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, it's over with, and the players then can reflect on it, put it to one side, have maybe a few games there where there's less pressure or there's nothing really on the games, to see how their performance differs between, God, this is what I feel like when I'm in a game where it maybe matters, and this is how I feel when, okay, we don't really have much on the game. So how do I manage my own self performance when there isn't maybe anything on the games, compared to, say, do my performances heighten after I've played a game when there's something on it?
So it's just a really interesting part of what football is for young people in the UK. My experiences in the US, I was out there a little longer than you, but my experiences in the US were that, by and large, these leagues mattered more often than not. And even in the situations where, ostensibly it didn't matter, it still did. Parents still looked up league tables and things like this,
Of course,
and
yeah.
and I've spoken before about issues of parents wanting players to play up age groups and what problems that causes and so on. It feels to me like what you're suggesting then is that over the course of a young player's journey through an academy, that there is a progressive exposure to competition. So I know
Yeah.
you've spoken a little bit about youth development players and so on, but I think in the article you wrote on this, you have a diagram where it's a fairly diagonal line across the diagram. Basically, obviously won't be as linear as that, but
No.
basically there is that progressive exposure. So what can you tell us a little bit more about what that might look like?
Yeah. So, obviously, in terms of foundation phase, maybe the way it is at the moment with the festivals, maybe the futsal being competitive, might just be enough. And, obviously the research didn't really delve into what it might look like necessarily, but it certainly was something that stemmed from the findings. And then lots of coaches then say about it needs to be drip fed into players, not just dumped on them at 16, going, there it is, that's football for you. From 16, try and get into the first team. It needs to be drip fed in a lot sooner than that, and learning how to compete, learning how to win, needs to be just exposed, needs to be given an awareness before the age of 16. So at 16, they are able to manage their emotions, manage, firstly, their feelings, their expectations, before they even consider how they're going to perform in that environment where it's different to maybe what they've experienced at youth development phase, foundation phase. It needs just to be exposed gradually. So what it might look like, Tim, is maybe at 12s, 11s, 12s, you may just get one block a month where they just have maybe some sort of game system where there's just 3 or 4 games against an opposition team where there's something a little bit more on it. There's maybe a little table or something, or the winner might go through and play the other winner, and that's it. Then when we get to 13s, 14s, they need to start understanding that preseason matters, and games at Christmas might mean more to games before Christmas or after Christmas. So that's where a bit of periodization comes in. And we maybe set out of the 6-week blocks and the cycles, say there's 6 cycles. Cycles 1 and 4 are competitive in a league table. And the winners of those get the reward for going on to maybe play in the next cycle or the next region even, and maybe localizing the regions, because that was another thing as well, is obviously the game system, and obviously travel time is something that a lot of coaches discuss. Traveling players from, and parents of course, across the country, going past, say, 10, 15, 20 clubs to drive to a certain club to then play 40, 50, 60 minutes of football to then drive all the way back. Is that really the most productive way of getting as many games, let's be honest, as many games that we can for our players exposed in their careers? Arguably, that's another discussion. But
yeah, we can certainly have that discussion another time. But I mean, look,
yeah,
other countries in Europe, we know full well that teams do not travel those distances week in, week out, youth teams at least. So, you've got some ideas around what some solutions might be. And clearly, look, I'm not going to put that on your shoulders, to solve this complex issue. But what you have done is been able to really identify the issue. And that's so important. But it sounds to me like, some of these solutions that you're suggesting are ideas here around progressive exposure that will also have to be progressively put in, because we could say, right, this is what we believe is the next best thing for us to do, but we've got players already in the system who haven't experienced along those lines. So we could say, yeah, from 14s you should be experiencing this level of competition, but they haven't had that progression previously. So this aspect of being able to deal with this slightly better, improve what our experience of competition is for our young players, that's also going to have to be slowly put in place.
Of course. Oh yeah, and a lot of the coaches actually asked whether I was asking players, as well as themselves, a lot of these questions, because they would be very interested in seeing the responses. And a lot of the coaches sort of summarized and said, Pete, I could tell you what they were going to say. They much rather the games where there's something on them, that there's an outcome, there's a consequence for maybe not being able to win. They would much rather play in those games than games where there's nothing really on them.
Yeah.
And the coaches then obviously that experience those games, because unfortunately, it's only at sort of Cat 1 where they really get to expose those games on a more frequent basis. Certainly do say that they have to reflect themselves really well in terms of how they've responded, how they've behaved, their body language to certain situations, and observed closely on how the players then have responded back. Because just from the reaction of, say, going 2 goals down in, let's say, an important game, or there's something on the game, and you've got 20 minutes to go, the body language and the behavior that you present, every single player will feel how you feel and respond in those moments of how you respond. So it does fall very much back on the coach. And of course, it'll change coaches' behaviors. It will. Of course it will. But my argument is that not a natural process? Is that not a natural aspect of the game that these players also need to get used to? Is coaches not just being this monotone emotional stability all of the time? Experiences when coaches get a little bit frustrated, and when coaches get overjoyed and excited. Players also need to feel, right, how can I still perform? How can I still make that crucial pass, the crucial shot, when there's excitement on the touchlines, when there's a motivation behind me to put this ball in the net?
Right.
All of those things, they have to be able to perform like. Well, we're watching players at the moment, in that exact moment, going, that's a great goal. He's finished that really, really well. But the coach's emotions are like very, very stable, and so are the players around.
Right.
Because
yeah, we've both spoken about this, haven't we? Where I've been involved in situations where player has done something outrageous, and in context as well. Maybe it's something where they've been struggling for some confidence. They haven't been performing so well, and then they suddenly do something that is, outrageous. And the feeling is that you can't celebrate it, you can't enjoy it. And I was watching Watford at the moment are doing a lot of mic'd up videos. I think
Yes.
it
Yeah.
was Ben Foster who really kind of started it all off. I think that's the right
Yeah.
keeper. And they've started micing up different coaches and so on. And I saw today actually they had one on the groundsman. That'd be interesting to watch. But there was one, and I think it's Hayden Mullins. I think I've got the right name. I could have given all kinds of different wrong names here. Let's say it's Hayden Mullins. And I think it was the under 23s. God, there's a lot of accuracy in this, isn't there? I think it was the under 23s team. Anyway, more importantly, the video, the players score, right? The team scores.
Yeah.
And the coach does absolutely nothing. There is no response whatsoever. And I'm not necessarily saying this is right. I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong. There could be all kinds of reasons as to why that's happened. But what was interesting for me was reading some of the comments. And obviously, a lot of this stuff, the comments aren't from coaches in the academy system, they're from Joe Blogs. But there were quite a number where there were different experiences of that coach not doing anything. Some were very confused by that. Some were even a little bit angry about that. And some were really applauding it as, not getting too involved in the game. Who knows what the reason was? But it really did get me reflecting a little bit on my own experiences of academy football. And I know this aligns with yours. Of can we actually show positive emotion when
Yeah.
things are going well? And
Yeah.
how aware are we of situations where we're either winning heavily or losing heavily, and we're having to perform? We're having to really put on for me, just a non-human face on it.
Yeah. There is a lot of that, Tim, and you're right. There's a lot of opinion on when I go back to that coach being emotionally stable. There's a lot of opinion on when the coach drops or goes above that line, and it's frowned upon. In most cases, I would feel, but I don't think we're then actually helping our players. And to quote another coach, are we actually doing them a disservice by doing that? Because what happens then is players then get used to that stable emotional support when, let's be honest, there's not much really on the games anyway, to be then thrown into an environment where emotions go from 0 to 100 back to 0 within minutes, every single minute, every day, every week. So for them to be used to that for years and years and years, no gradual exposure to it, very limited time to experience those things, and yet alone be able to manage or try and deal with those emotions whilst performing, to be then thrown in and expect to still perform like they did the previous season and keep that level of performance, I would say for a lot of players, it's unattainable. You can't expect players to go from being in a game system where no games really matter to being in a games program where everything matters, and expect the performance to be the same, or if not, slightly different.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's obviously important for us to both say as well that by saying and speaking about coaches being able to be uh, emotionally accessible, let's put it that way, that we're also not saying that we're then at the extremes, and that is
Of course.
part of the problem. But at the same
Yes.
time, as you said, that kind of monotone, singular line of emotional responses also doesn't really appear to be particularly useful. I want to, in terms of starting to wrap this up, I want to have a little thought experiment with you of, let's say that we are in a situation where competition is brought in on a gradual exposure, but competition is brought in a little bit more. My thinking is that what we would see is more of players, particularly towards end of games, starting to employ, let's just call them dark arts,
Of course. Yeah.
right?
Managing the game.
Or even through the game,
Yeah.
kicking the ball away. I mean, look, we all know them. End of game,
Yeah,
going into a
it would be.
corner.
I would say personally, I would class it and hear a lot of coaches shout it at times. Go and manage the game.
Mm-hmm.
By going to manage the game, you are doing little things like that to obviously maybe waste time or get the opposition a little bit frustrated. Those things I would class as managing the game, and are things that as players that performing at that level, you just need to get used to and not let it affect you personally.
Right. And I guess then it's another example of not having exposure to competition means that you don't have that savviness.
No,
As
and
I said earlier, we were fortunate enough to take a group from Bristol to a Premier League power play tournament, and we were doing really well. And power play, 12 minutes, any time during the game, 2 minutes, music's on, all goals are worth double. Wonderful experience for coaches and for players. Anyway,
yeah,
we're playing Chelsea. We've managed to play really well against higher categories up till now, but this is quite a jump for us. Category 3 to Category 1, playing against Chelsea. We go 1-0 up. I think my job's done. Yeah, clipboard down. I've solved football, completed it, mate. Music comes on, and 2 minutes later, we are 12-1 down.
yeah,
All that's happened is these Chelsea boys have waited until the music comes on, managed themselves, managed the game, made sure that they weren't conceding anymore, taking a couple of risks, but not many. As soon as the music came on, bang, they were in.
yeah,
And it really showed to me just how little exposure we were giving to my players in terms of having some game sense, having some savviness.
yeah. Of course. And Tim, to add on to that point, the coaches that were Cat Ones were obviously more fortunate to go out on tours,
Right.
play in tournaments and festivals out there, where in terms of this topic, it looks so different to the games that are experienced by those Cat 1 teams in this country. Even those Cat 1 coaches comment on our boys as Cat 1 players not ready or not exposed enough to compared to the players that they're playing against from Holland, Spain, all of those countries. And it just gets them to think, well, have we got enough? Have we got enough? Well, compared to maybe, those countries where like you said, more games are obviously played because of the location and the travel time. But on top of that, there's more games that mean something or have consequences for the game. And those boys are experienced to deal with those situations from a younger age, arguably, than what we're exposing those players to in this country. So those boys are picking up those skills of being able to manage their emotions, self-reflection on how I've performed. I've conceded that goal. That's let it affect me, because the next time I got the ball, I wasn't really concentrating. My pass was off, or whatever. But those things and all of those skills are solved by those players a lot earlier
Hmm.
than the players arguably in this country. So that's what you're seeing then. At 13, 14 years old, we go and play those boys and those players. Those players are far more used to managing games. They all manage their own emotions much better. If they go a goal down, 2 goals down, they feel like they're able to really perform and still perform whilst games not going their way happen. Whereas our experiences in terms of coaches, we see a goal go down or a goal up, and then the impact on what the next action is has a greater effect on our players as it does to the opposition players in that sense. Mm-hmm. And that arguably is something that obviously is why the research was put together, is why coaches feel like there should be more of it. Not as much maybe as those other countries. I'm not saying that, we should have it the same as those countries, but certainly maybe something similar, because that element of the game, no matter where you're from, is vital.
Yeah, a really complex issue that, look, we're not going to solve today. Of course, we're not.
No.
There'd have to be a cultural and an organizational shift to really get close to something that's more appropriate. I don't want to say a solution, because I don't necessarily feel like there is a right solution.
No, there isn't.
But what your research has done, and why I wanted to have you on the pod today, was really expose some of the complexities of this particular issue, and that there is a way in which we can more naturally produce exposure to competition that wouldn't land that responsibility with the coaching staff, which both you and I, and then a lot of the coaches that you interviewed, have experienced. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Tim.
A question for you, slightly different.
Yeah.
If you could have an audience with just one person, who would you choose?
I had an audience that had just one person.
No, if you could have an audience with one person,
who would I choose? Klopp.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Why Klopp?
I think many people can see the reasons and the behaviours that Klopp has. Klopp is able to manage his emotions, although sometimes you may not see it. Klopp can manage his emotions. Whether he takes a player off the pitch, he knows that emotion running through that player at that time. He's able to manage his emotions through it. When Liverpool draw a game and the crowd are thinking, why are they celebrating so badly? There's always a reason why Klopp behaves and models the behaviour to arguably some of the best players in the world. And even at those times, some of those players are questioning, why is he behaving like that?
You know what? I'd love to ask him. If I mean, as you well know, I'm a Liverpool fan, but I'd love to ask him if we were able to get together with him. I'd love to unpack some of those moments and really find out, look, how much of this was conscious, how much of this is deliberate, because not all of it is. Surely not all of it.
No.
But it'd be so interesting to find out his reflections on it.
Yeah, and if you think, there's not many moments where he's made a real mistake in terms of his behaviour. And he's very, over the years of his professional career, there's not many real media mistakes that have really hit the media on the way he's behaved, unlike maybe other coaches. So there's definitely elements there that's why my audience I'd love for it to be him.
Yeah.
Because he comes across maybe to most as someone that's out of control, bit bonkers, doesn't really know maybe what he's doing at times. But I see a man that is extremely well behaved well behaved in terms of how he manages his emotions every game, in heightened games, in some of the most emotionally heightened, extended, extreme cases of sport that can be ever experienced.
Yeah, I wonder. There was one recently, wasn't there? With the Burnley game, was it? I'd be
I think
interested to
so.
know, because that was the first time that I thought, wonder if there was a little bit of an emotional hijack there at that halftime spat, as they
Yeah.
put it, between the two of
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
But I think Sean Dyche is very, very calculated with that kind of thing as
Yes.
well. So
Of course.
no, it'd be fascinating. It'd be fascinating. Where can
But,
people find you if they want to reach out?
so I've this article is hopefully going out on a few coaching outlets and organisations. Tim, you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. And yeah, I'd love to be able to discuss this and just raise awareness, really, of this topic. Like I said, I'm not looking at solutions are miles away, but just for people to maybe get an appreciation of maybe the importance, sharing the experiences of what those other coaches have gone through. And I know it's a very small pool of coaches in comparison to the industry, but for there to be such a powerful opinion that was shared by those coaches, but taken from the opinions of other coaches that they've spoken to, you could really feel a sense of, yeah, actually, this might need a bit more thinking over or consideration.
Yeah, I hope what you're doing with your research means that some of those changes will happen. Pete, thanks again. Always a pleasure to speak to you. Welcome to the tribe.
Thank you very much, Tim. Pleasure as always.
That's it for episode 4 of season 2. Pete and I could go on talking about this and other coaching issues as we regularly do, and I hope it sparks some thoughts about competition in your environment. If you have anything to add to this discussion, give us both a shout. The music you are listening to is by BB Phoenix. Her online discography and further details are in the links. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope this finds you well, and we look forward to seeing you back here again next week.